Healing by D.H. Lawrence. I am not a mechanism, an assembly of various sections, and it is not because the mechanism is working wrongly that I am ill. I am ill because of wounds to the soul, to the deep emotional self, and the wounds to the soul take a long, long time, only time can help, and patience, and a certain difficult repentance, long difficult repentance, realization of life's mistake, and the freeing oneself from the endless repetition of the mistake which mankind at large has chosen to sanctify. Welcome to the Poetry Oracle podcast, and thank you for listening. This poem is one of my all-time favorites, and it came to me as I awoke at 3 a.m. in a deep and sudden sadness. I then found out only a few hours later of a mass shooting in Dayton, Ohio, while I was sleeping, where my lovely daughter serves the community as a physician, and while thankfully not one of the victims or the witnesses, or having to give her best to treat the carnage, as she was not on call at the hospital, yet she and all of us are again victims. Victims of an ignorance coupled with such a deep anger, plugged in with guns made to kill en masse, a formula for destruction of innocent people that has reached epic proportions in America, this the third mass shooting in a week. So I sit here in this sadness for all those we lost, that I should have to even make that kind of a call to check on my lovely Ashley, and even for the shooter himself, how these lone American, normally white men, ignorant, confused, and mortally wounded with such deep anger to take innocent lives in their explosion of violence. And I say, as I write this in tears, how much love I feel for the victims, their families, for law enforcement who has to go into the breach and stop the carnage, for all that were witnesses to the carnage, for the medical personnel who had to treat the injured and try to save the ones they could not save. The fallout from this carnage goes deep and wide in the collective psyche of America and in the collective soul of the world. D.H. Lawrence's poem, of course, as all great poems do, can be applied in this situation. What is the, quote, endless repetition of the mistake that mankind sanctifies? Mistake is defined as an action or judgment that is misguided or wrong. And to sanctify is to set apart as or declare as holy, to consecrate. In this case, the collective psyche in America, and no other country has this, has a shadow of violence in this form wrapped up in hate, consecrated with politics and religion, and coupled with guns that kill tens and hundreds of people in a few seconds, culminating into a darkly holy virtual powder keg which has been repeating itself for years now, from sea to shining sea. And now to the single human soul. None of us are mechanisms, and yet we can be treated this way by the world, made to feel as automatons, units of production, robotic money-earning machines, and that we are to be strong, not vulnerable, and this is deeply wounding to soul. Lawrence suggests that these kinds of wounds take an inordinately long time to heal, and the medicines include mostly time and patience, and Lawrence's absolutely brilliant offering of a certain difficult repentance, quote, as balm over the soul wounds. Repentance is defined as feeling a sincere regret or remorse, as Lawrence says in this prose, for our misguided actions and judgments. And this is a process, very difficult, not overnight, and can't be healed with a quick prescription, a repeated mantra, or some diversionary avenue, or even faith. that takes us away from the vulnerable truth of ourselves. And with kind compassion for ourselves, I think that we are all patients at one time or another in the soul emergency room at Vulnerability Hospital, trying to recover from being treated as impervious mechanisms. And the doctors and nurses that hopefully come along to help heal us in time can be from many places, and yet they all got their training in the school of compassion, forgiveness, and love. And like all emergency rooms, there are casualties, some that just could not be healed, including those that put a gun in their hand and take innocent lives, and then often their own, out of a repetition of confused anger and pain. I look at myself and my past mistakes and what I regret and feel remorse for on mine own ER gurney. I feel the wounds of battles fought, won, or lost for what I thought was right, and those I wounded with my righteous, sword-drawn crusades, when perhaps more of my vulnerable compassion and love could have been a kinder and softer response. I feel about how often, as I was trained as a mechanism, to be strong, brave, and to even throw myself in harm's way in trying to make the world a little safer or better. Part of that I remain proud of in accomplishing those missions, and part of it I also now realize how I was not showing a reverence and compassion and full love for myself and the value of this truly precious life I have been given, as I was willing to blindly sacrifice it at some times too easily in some mission of righteousness. Even courage and bravery has a shadow, and that is the particular inflection of it for me, that perhaps in sacrificing myself, others, and even I, would finally and truly love me fully as I am. And in all that confused anger of the modern American gunman taking out whole groups of innocent people, there is a similar dark thread of a confused mission of righteousness and an exaggerated self-hate where he easily can sacrifice himself by believing he was right in his action and that someone will love him for it, and he finally can be vindicated, crying out in his all-consuming pain of self-hate. And so I feel and hope I am now in the recovery room at least, still shaky, sword and armor of righteousness and judgment off, naked under the thin onesie worn in the ER, the back's not even tied, and my arse is hanging out for all to see. And I am getting more and more comfortable with that, under the watchful eye of the kind doctors and nurses in my life who love me no matter what, as I am, and I as I seek to fully do the same of myself. Last night I witnessed here in Santa Fe a group of brave, vulnerable people who allowed images of their bodies to be shown in a presentation of what might be called vulnerability imagery. They then talked about their experiences of that process and how it inculcated in them a love of their bodies, imperfect by the mechanism standards of what a body is, quote, supposed to look like, where anything out of those narrow definitions of body beauty is to be hidden behind clothing, closed doors, and certainly not to be shown in public. I see each and every one of these people from all walks of life with different body sizes and features, physical and emotional body traumas, and our traumas and emotions are carried in the body, not in the mind, stand up from their gurneys and proudly march forth, completely naked, in front of many other patients in the soul ER, and become vulnerability doctors and nurses for us all. The photographer himself, who provided images of his own body, strong and vulnerable, is a vascular soul surgeon himself. That reminds me now that we can all be doctors and nurses of vulnerability, of a kind, fiercely directed compassion. And by the way, one inflection of the word fierce is defined as showing a heartfelt and powerful intensity. Beginning with love for ourselves first, and then for others who are burdened with the mechanistic traumas that are delivered to us all in this world. Lawrence's formula for healing is not a new discovery, but what soul has always wanted, only to be rediscovered and then administered to ourselves and to others in the human condition. Deep bow and blessings until next week, and love expressed from my gurney right next to yours. About D.H. Lawrence. David Herbert Lawrence was an English writer and poet. His collected works represent, among other things, an extended reflection upon the dehumanizing effects of modernity and industrialization. Some of the issues Lawrence explores are sexuality, emotional health, vitality, spontaneity, and instinct. Lawrence's opinions earned him many enemies, and he endured official persecution, censorship, and misrepresentation of his creative work throughout the second half of his life, much of which he spent in a voluntary exile he called his savage pilgrimage. He traveled the world in exile, finally arriving in Taos, New Mexico here, in 1924, where he said, quote, "I want to gather together about 20 souls and sail away from this world of war and squalor and find a little colony where there shall be no money but a sort of communism as far as necessaries of life and some real decency, a place where one can live simply apart from the civilization, with a few people who are also at peace and happy and live and understand and be free." With Mabel Dodge Lujan, a prominent local socialite, they acquired the 160-acre Kiowa Ranch, now called the D.H. Lawrence Ranch, in 1924 from Dodge Lujan in exchange for the manuscript of Sons and Lovers. Lawrence stayed in New Mexico for 2 years, with extended visits to Lake Chapala and Oaxaca in Mexico. While Lawrence was in New Mexico, he was visited by Aldous Huxley. However, in March 1925, he suffered a near-fatal attack of malaria and tuberculosis while on a third visit to Mexico. Although he eventually recovered, the diagnosis of his condition obliged him to return again to Europe. He was dangerously ill, and the poor health limited his ability to travel for the remainder of his life. He made his home in a villa in northern Italy, living near Florence, where he wrote The Virgin and the Gypsy and the various versions of Lady Chatterley's Lover in 1928. After being discharged from a sanatorium, he died in 1930 at age 45 in Vence, France, from complications of tuberculosis. Frida Weekly, his wife, commissioned an elaborate headstone for his grave, bearing a mosaic of his adopted emblem of the phoenix, my favorite myth story, of death and rebirth, and which has a worldwide significance in many cultures. He is buried at the D.H. Lawrence Ranch in Taos. At the time of his death, his public reputation was that of a pornographer who had wasted his considerable talents, quote. We can see that posthumously he transcended that moniker and is now one of the greatest writers of his time.